In this video, we're going to go over the clothing and equipment that is required for our grade 10 winter camp. All of this equipment and clothing should be brought in with the student at their gear check. We won't go over every item line by line, however, we will touch on some of the more important things to consider when packing for the trip. The first thing that you want to consider is the larger backpack or duffel bag. We're happy for the students to provide their gear inside a duffel bag or inside a larger style backpack. Either of these are suitable because the students will not be carrying all of their clothing and equipment for very long. I think it's about a 5 to 10 minute snowshoe from where the bus drops us off into the campground where the students will be spending the night. The key point is though that this backpack or waterproof duffel bag should be large enough to put all of the students' stuff inside it. You want to avoid having things strapped or dangling on the outside, only because if there is snow or any form of precipitation, that can cause the things on the outside of the backpacks or duffel bag to get quite wet, and then it has the potential of freezing. We also ask that the students bring a small day bag with them. That can be their school bag or something smaller in order to be able to put a snack and some water as well as some extra layers when they go on their day trip snowshoe or out and about around the cabins. Okay, so some of the more important things that we want to look at with you is the sleeping bag. So if your son or daughter was here in middle school, we had asked, we put a little asterisk by the sleeping bag on the clothing and equipment list for that, saying that in grade 10 they will require a -12 sleeping bag, and that is the minimum rating that we suggest. If you're unsure about what the rating of your sleeping bag is, sometimes you can find it just in a tag along the edge of the zipper, or often it will be at the bottom tags at the bottom and the base of the sleeping bag. What you need to consider about the sleeping bag is that it does have a hood, and often the winter rated bags -12 or colder will also have a collar. And the idea of the collar is that when it's done up, it goes around the student's shoulders and it allows the body heat to be trapped inside instead of escaping through the hood, or and it helps keep the student or individual really nice and warm. If you don't have a -12 sleeping bag, we strongly recommend that you ask either other grade 10 students who may be on a different camp than your son or daughter, or ask a grade 11 or 12 family who have gone through the winter camp program as the first option to sourcing out a sleeping bag that will be cold enough. If those aren't options for you, MEC does rent winter rated sleeping bags, and that would be a good alternative. And lastly, if you wanted to purchase an over bag, it is a sort of a lighter looking sleeping bag that adds a few degrees of warmth to another sleeping bag that you may have. We are going to be checking the rating of the sleeping bags with the students to ensure that they have something that is going to be warm enough for their overnight in their tent. So in a winter environment, the students are setting up their camp and tenting on snow. So what the school will be providing for the students is a closed foam ensilite pad, and this will act as a barrier to the cold snow from inside the tent. So the students will lay out their ensilite pad, and then they will on top of that put their own thermarest or sleeping pad. So it's really important that the students have their own sleeping pad, and then we will provide them with this extra closed foam pad to insulate them from the snow. We will also provide to the students something called a stomp pad, and this will be used when they're outside. They can stand on this or they can sit on this, and the same rules apply for it. It's a closed foam mat that insulates the students from the snow. When you're out on the winter camp, what is really important is that the students stay warm and dry. And one of the things that they can do in order to keep their feet nice and warm is have an appropriate pair of winter boots. We in the outdoor education department like these boots that have the rubber base, because that's what will be hitting the snow, and so keeping them nice and waterproof. As well, we really like these boots because they're tall enough so that if the students are walking around in the snow is not going in and through their ankles, getting their socks wet. And the last nice thing about these boots is that they have a liner that comes out. And the reason why the liner coming out is important is because when the students get ready to go to bed, they'll put their boots on the outside of their tent, and then they can pull the liners out and they can put these inside their sleeping bags, and the liners will not freeze, because the boots on the outside of the tent will inevitably freeze. And it's nice to not have to put your feet into frozen ice blocks, and having these inside your tent will allow them to be warm and dry come the morning time. If you are at all unsure about the winter boots that your son or daughter has, please feel free to bring them in ahead of the camp for us to check out. And the same thing with the winter boots applies as the same as the sleeping bag. If you don't have an appropriate pair of winter boots, we strongly recommend asking other students either in the same grade, on different camps, or in the grades above that would have experienced the camp already. For the water bottle, we recommend having one of these water bottles that has a wide mouth. The reason for that is the typical sports water bottles that have a little nozzle at the top, that can often freeze and not be very good in the cold weather. These wide mouths, while the water might freeze, you'll still be able to get a knife or a utensil in there of some sort to break off the top layer of the ice. Also, these are less prone to spilling, and one thing that I really like to do with a water bottle is to fill it with hot water in the evening, put it in a sock and stick it inside my sleeping bag to keep it, to warm up my sleeping bag before I get into it. And with this nice wide mouth, these don't leak, and that's really important if the student's going to be using it for a little hot water bottle warming up their sleeping bag. So one of these forms of water bottles is going to be the best. And the last thing that I'm going to touch on in the equipment is the helmet. So the students have the option of either skating or tobogganing on the evening that they're spending the night in their cabins, and or potentially doing both depending on the time. And the students need to have a helmet for both of those activities. This helmet can be like this one, which is a typical ski helmet. It could be a hockey helmet, and at last resort it could also be a bike helmet. But one of those sorts of helmets would be ideal for the students to have for their evening activity on the second night. And one last thing is the camera. Students will not be having their cell phones. There is no cell service available. So if the students want to take pictures of their own, there will be there's an optional camera on the clothing and equipment list, and they're welcome to bring that to take photos. We will also be providing cameras to the larger group. We'll have a few cameras floating around, so the students will have an opportunity to take some photos, and we will share those photos with the students at the end of their camping experience. I'll turn it over to Mr. McKillop now, who will talk about the clothing required for the winter camp.
The most important thing about clothing on the winter camp is that it keeps us warm and dry. So there's a few rules that we have to keep in mind when it comes to how we're dressing ourselves in the winter environment. One of the most important ones is that we do not allow students to bring anything on the trip that's made of cotton. The reason for that is that when cotton gets wet, it takes a really long time to dry, and when we're camping in the snow, we essentially can't get cotton to dry out. So if students are wearing cotton t-shirts or cotton socks, then if they get wet, either through perspiration or from the environment around them, we can't get it to dry off, and so then students are wearing wet clothes for the rest of the day, which clearly we want to avoid. So making sure that any gear that students bring with them is non-cotton is a really important starting place. The second most important thing for students in terms of what they're wearing on the winter camp is that they are wearing layers. And the reason for that is the more layers you have, the easier it is to adjust your temperature in incremental stages instead of having one really warm layer where if you have it on, you're maybe too hot, but if you take it off, you're too cold. So what would somebody look like in terms of what they're wearing when they're on their winter camp? Well, first thing is you would have a base layer. So either a long or a short sleeve base layer like this. This one is made of wool, but you can also have synthetic material like this. Most athletic shirts, football strips, so on and so forth, will be a synthetic, so there's no need to go out and buy anything specific for winter camp if you already have non-cotton short or long sleeve shirts. On top of the base layer, we would like to see students wearing a sort of mid layer, a fleece like this, or perhaps a thinner down jacket like this one here. On top of that mid layer, in the evening, when the sun goes down and it's getting quite cold around camp, then we'd expect students to put on their warmest layer. And ideally that will be either a really heavy fleece or a down jacket like this. So at minimum, a student would be wearing a base layer, a mid layer on top, a warm layer, and then their warmest layer on top of that. Of course, all of these things need to fit such that the outer layer can be worn on top of everything else underneath. Another important factor in staying warm when we're on the camp is staying dry. And so it's really important that students have good rain gear. This is a Gore-Tex shell jacket, and it's important that the shell students bring with them can be worn on top of all of their insulating layers so that they can stay warm with their insulating layers and stay dry with their shell jacket like this. So make sure that before students leave for the trip, they check by literally putting on all of their gear that their shell can go over the top. For this particular camp, if students want to bring a ski jacket, that's fine, but we ask them to make sure that if they're using it as a rain jacket, they also have warm layers that can go underneath. Or if they're using this as a warm layer, they have a rain jacket that can go over the top. The reason for that is that when students are out and about in camp, if this jacket is keeping them both dry and warm, when they go into their tent, they may still require warmth in their tent, but they don't want to be wearing a wet outer layer. So they need to be able to take off their wet layer and put on a warm layer for in their tent. We ask students to bring with them 2 pairs of gloves and 2 toques. When it comes to the gloves, we recommend that they have one heavy, well-insulated pair and one lighter, lightweight liner style glove. It's important that the lightweight glove isn't a mitt and that it has individual fingers, because that makes it easier for students to operate stoves or for when they're putting their tent together. The heavier glove can be a mitt or a regular glove style, but it needs to be waterproof and have good insulation. We ask students to bring with them 2 toques. If one of them gets wet, they should have a backup, and it's always nice to go to bed with a warm toque on your head. The same layering system applies for our lower half as it does for our upper half, and so we ask students to bring with them a pair of long johns, so a thin synthetic or wool layer like this, and then a warmer pair of trousers like a fleece like this or a down if you have them, and then a shell waterproof layer that can be worn on top of all of those to keep students dry from snow or rain. Another thing that we ask students to bring with them is a hiking pant like this, which they can use when they are snowshoeing or skate skiing. Not as warm as a fleece or down pair of pants, but can be worn over the top of long johns. One place where the non-cotton rule is really important is in our socks. We ask students to bring with them 3 pairs of medium thickness non-cotton socks, and a ski sock like this is perfect.
On top of all the personal clothing and equipment that the students will be bringing, which we've just outlined for you, the students will also be provided some group gear. That includes the tent and cooking equipment, as well as the snowshoes and any of the other specialized equipment, including skates for skating, the tobogganing slides, and the skate ski equipment, those will all be provided for the students. So what you need to be concerned about is what's on this list. And should you have any questions about it, or you're wondering if an item is suitable, please ask your son or daughter to come in and see us in the outdoor education department, or stop by, or send us an email yourself.